What exactly determines whether a job is hard to play? It is, indeed, a lot of things, and some things affect some players more than others, and sometimes what content you do can also matter in regards to which job is quote-unquote the hardest. Now, to help me answer the question of which tank is the hardest, I sent out a poll to ask all of you. A lot of you did vote, but I will admit that the percentage spread was honestly pretty close to what I had anticipated anyway. Now, you may have already peeked at the video length or even the chapters and noticed that multiple jobs are up for debate, and indeed, we will be talking about what could make each job feel difficult, ranging between many different skill levels all the way from casual to hardcore optimization, trying to squeeze every single point of damage possible. We'll be talking about the jobs in order from quote-unquote easiest to quote-unquote hardest as well. Also, some of you might be saying, what's the point? Dawntrail is coming real soon anyway. And the point is exactly to see if these jobs become easier with Dawntrail. And with that, let's get started. For the easiest job, with very few votes, we have Warrior, which I anticipated some players would vote on, but I also anticipated some players would outright ridicule even the concept that Warrior could be viewed as difficult, which also happened in the comments, by the way. Now, what could make Warrior difficult, and conversely, what is it that makes Warrior so easy? For Warrior, we need to look at the difference between low-level and high-level Warrior, how much you gain from coordinating your own cooldowns, and how much you gain from coordinating with your raid. Warrior is very strange when leveling, as when it is below level 56, defensively it is lacking raw intuition, and offensively it is lacking inner release. This means that the job is lacking most of its self-healing options. Not all, but most of the best ones. And for attacking, you would need to stockpile Beast Gauge for every Berserk window, which gets awkward due to how Berserk ends up lining up with your rotation. Regularly, you will have to choose between overcapping Gauge or using a Fell Cleave or Inner Beast, and then lacking it when Berserk comes up. However, once Raw Intuition is acquired, the defensive part becomes far easier. And once Inner Release is acquired, the whole Beast Gauge stockpiling becomes kind of optional? What, then, makes Warrior seem extremely easy for a lot of players is that at max level, Warrior actually gains nothing from coordinating their own cooldowns. Inner Release gives you 3 direct critting Fell Cleaves and a Primal Rend. As long as Surging Tempest is running, all of your attacks do full damage all the time, so simply pressing the glowy button when it appears will serve you just fine. Defensively, a Warrior can also get extremely far by just pressing Bloodwetting when it is available, to the point that some players believe that if a Warrior dies in casual content, the Warrior is the only one to blame, regardless of what the healer or even the rest of the group did. That isn't entirely true, but it does speak loads about how easy Warrior is perceived to be. Now, what if we look at Warrior from the perspective of raid group optimization? Then we start to think about burst windows, and also the use of tinctures. Typically, we can view the 2-minute burst window as a 15-second window, leaving about 6 GZDs to fill. This will typically be the 3 inner release Fell Cleaves, Primal Rend, and 2 extra GZDs. Optimally, the 2 remaining GZDs will be inner chaos, but while you can easily stockpile 1 Infuriate, due to the cooldown reduction of Infuriate, the second charge would come up a bit randomly, which can make it tough to make it line up where you want it to appear. Furthermore, if you have longer raid buffs or are using a tincture, then the burst window could be extended to up to 12 GCDs, which would mean you would benefit from, say, bringing a full Beast Gauge into the burst for 2 extra Fell Cleaves. These things combine to produce a burst that could be slightly challenging, and also involves resource stockpiling. But that probably also explains why a relatively small percentage of players find Warrior to be the most difficult, and it's usually not the ones maining it. Next up, Paladin has a similar situation to Warrior, where there is a massive difference in how the job is at lower levels and how it is at max level. However, the comparison between personal optimization and raid coordinator optimization is closer together in a way. The Paladin leveling is quite brutal in its own right. Notably, for the majority of the leveling, while you do have a burst in fight or flight, you hardly have anything to put in it, making the rotation extremely simple. However, the attack rotation being insanely basic is made up for by the lack of any good self-healing for nearly the entire leveling of the job. No, clemency doesn't really count. This means you have to focus way harder on maximizing your defensive cooldowns to reduce the damage you take to compensate. So, while Warrior has a more balanced situation in leveling, Paladin has a heavy emphasis on the defensive cooldown difficulty. This continues just about to level 82 when Holy Sheltron and later Divine Magic Mastery 2 adds a lot of regular self-healing to the kit. However, this still produces this situation where Paladin can feel brutally tough and even outright weak for a lot of the leveling period. And similarly, as the defensive toolkit gets fleshed out, the offensive toolkit does too. And what makes Paladin more difficult than Warrior in this regard is the simple fact that Paladin gains value from making sure all of their buttons are used in the fight or flight window. Which does mean, with the possibilities of various cooldown drifting over the course of a fight, that cooldowns can misalign with this, and in a way make Paladin feel more difficult. This is further amplified by actions like Goring Blade, which is distinctly single target, and not worth using at a certain number of enemy targets, yet has a cooldown that perfectly aligns with fight or flight, making it difficult to know for sure whether it is worth it to use Goring Blade during fight or flight anyway. Similarly, OGCDs like Expiation and Circle of Scorn can drift just enough that they miss the fight or flight window. This means that Paladins may be put in a situation of having to weigh whether it is worth delaying these cooldowns for the next fight or flight window, or using them on cooldown if they want to be optimal. However, the rotation of Paladin in general is somewhat simple, with a priority list for filler that flips during fight or flight or other buffs, and the most obvious outliers in the rotation is when you need to step away from an enemy momentarily, where Paladin gets the option to use their ranged options to keep up the attack, where other tanks would simply not be able to do that. However, because of how fight or flight sort of naturally lines up with raid buffs anyway, it means that when trying to optimize for a coordinated raid group, you basically do the exact same thing as when you were optimizing for just yourself, with the exception that you might add tinctures into the mix. This again means that most of the difficulty of optimizing Paladin in a coordinated group is the same as optimizing it alone, which puts a huge amount of emphasis on the priority rotation, and whether you can do that right or not, and make sure the cooldowns are used on cooldown without drifting anything out of fight or flight. And then of course the defensive cooldown usage until they become more reliable and powerful at much higher levels. The fact that playing the job right even in a more casual setting comes very close to the way it is played at its peak explains greatly how a significant amount of players find it hard to play. This then leads us on to the second hardest, Dark Knight, which, I just want to be clear, there is a colossal gap between Dark Knight and Paladin, and a rather small gap between Dark Knight and Gunbreaker, so it is a pretty close second place. And Dark Knight is similar to Warrior in some ways, yet completely different in others. Which also explains why there are a lot of players that find it just as absurd that anyone would find Dark Knight hard to play, which also was perfectly reflected in the comments. Notably, for the leveling of Dark Knight, the majority of the experience you are missing TPN, and it becomes a lot more manageable once you have it. But before that point, Dark Knight feels very comparable to Paladin in the way that you sort of lack in defensive cooldown options, although having slightly more self-healing available does help even this out. However, due to TPN being unlocked so far into the leveling process, many Dark Knights have a weird relationship with it, and feel like using TPN is like wasting damage, even though when used right, it is free mitigation rather than a damage loss. Additionally, again, because of the weirdness of TPN, Dark Knights often have trouble with knowing exactly when it is time to use it, especially in AoE pulls. By the way, for anyone thinking exactly this, the answer is all the time when you're actively tanking a lot of damage in an AoE pull. Just smash that like button, I mean the TPN button. Let's move on. In terms of personal optimization at max level, Dark Knight is like Warrior, but with way more buttons, in that you have no buttons that boost your damage beyond maintaining Dark Side. So simply spending everything as you get it is mostly fine, with the exception of keeping MP for a TPN just in case, and having enough gauge for Living Shadow, at least until Dawn Trail. Essentially, as long as everything is used when available, you would maximize your damage personally, meaning that the floor for doing well as a Dark Knight is, similar to Warrior, very low in a way. You wouldn't even need to hold plunges or Shadowbringers, just use everything. But this of course makes the gap to raid coordinated optimization much larger. With a coordinated raid burst window of about 15 seconds, and Dark Knight having quite a lot of cooldowns to fit in it, it makes the job exceptionally busy in the burst window, but also puts quite a lot more emphasis on making sure everything is used on time. To outline how many cooldowns we're talking about, at peak, a Dark Knight would have at least 4 Edges, Carbon Spit, Salted Earth and Salt and Darkness, 2 Shadowbringers, 2 Plunges, and Living Shadow. And that's assuming Blood Weapon and Delirium are used before the burst begins. You'd also want to stockpile extra blood gauge for extra blood spillers, and the edges come from a nearly maxed out MP bar. And all this can still get bigger, since if you can bring Dark Arts from a broken TPN into the burst, you could actually have 5 edges. Depending on your knowledge of a given fight, this trick of bringing Dark Arts into your burst can be easier or harder. Whether the fight itself requires you to defend yourself during the burst can also make things harder, since you simply won't have any OGCD space for anything else during the burst. On the one hand, the exact order of everything is not super crucial. On the other hand, you still need to do everything, and there are slight advantages to doing things in a specific order. The simple fact that a defensive cooldown features as part of your offensive toolkit like this does elevate Dark Knight quite high in difficulty. But in a similar fashion, the fact that just using your cooldowns as they come up is good enough for most content as a Dark Knight also can make Dark Knight appear to be a very easy job, depending on what kind of content you do. Which of course leads us to the hardest tank to play, Gunbreaker. Right out the gate, a lot of players might find the job a lot harder simply because it starts at a higher level, making it feel harder to pick up as a result. Beyond that point, Gunbreaker is also often described as a DPS job in disguise. And DPS jobs typically have more involved rotations, which makes sense given how the Gunbreaker rotation is like a stricter, busier version of the Paladin rotation. However, Gunbreaker actually starts out with a decent amount of defensives, so it doesn't have nearly as much of a problem with lack of defensives or healing as Dark Knight or Paladin when leveling. The biggest addition throughout the leveling of Gunbreaker is usually just seen as Heart of Stone and Continuation, which both don't add that much to it. With that said, optimizing Gunbreaker from a personal standpoint is all about using everything during No Mercy, and then using the Gnashing Fang combo alongside Blasting Zone again 30 seconds later. This of course becomes a bit more complicated on AoE with how you might not want to use your single target only options like the Gnashing Fang combo or Sonic Break, similar to Paladin. With that said, while this leaves a lot of empty space to just do 1, 2, 3 combos in, the entire rotation is actually so tight that with no skill speed, there's not a single GCD left to spare. A single second lost or delayed and now your rotation is behind. Optimally, you need to generate 4 cartridges in a minute for 2 Gnashing Fangs and a double down. At least. And that takes 30 seconds to accomplish. And with the Gnashing Fang combos, Sonic Break and Double Down in the rotation itself, that takes up 20 seconds, leaving a remaining 10 seconds for exactly 1 full combo and a burst strike. More speed can give an extra GC to work with or a bit of wiggle room in case you get delayed, but it does mean that the Gunbreaker rotation is similar to the Paladin rotation in that it bursts every minute and you're incentivized to use everything in that window, but also has a much greater emphasis on the filler in between, which even comes with a proper, smaller burst in between, which Paladin just does not have in the same way. Gunbreaker's Bloodfest even adds an even bigger burst every 2 minutes that aligns with the raid burst window. Which, of course, also explains why the distance between optimizing your rotation personally and coordinating with a raid group is surprisingly small for Gunbreaker. Similar to Paladin, it simply has the capacity to add a tincture to the burst and gives even more reason to front-load the burst in No Mercy to make sure the bigger damage comes out during the raid buffs. The one thing that can make this even harder for a Gunbreaker is that when optimizing for just yourself, you could just delay your burst a GCD or two if something goes wrong, so you can make sure your No Mercy is just right. Where when optimizing around a coordinated group, you can't do that. The raid buffs are coming and you just have to be ready when they're there. Which means that a single unnecessary delay of any kind can be very obviously felt on a Gunbreaker, where, compared to the other tanks, a warrior probably won't feel much, a Dark Knight might have slightly less MP, but still enough for their burst, and a Paladin probably will be perfectly able to do their burst filler just the same. A Gunbreaker might actually have to adjust their burst on the fly if they are a single GCD slow or lacking a cartridge for some reason. So before we round up, there are a few factors that I do recognize also play into a ranking of difficulty of jobs. Naturally, players that main a given job typically find that job a lot easier to play. Meaning, for example, that people that never played Warrior might be inclined to say that Warrior is hard. Similarly, Gunbreaker mains would be less likely to say that Gunbreaker was hardest. Another factor is that in a poll like this, some people might just vote on whatever they believe is hardest, and Gunbreaker and Dark Knight are known to be the harder of the four, which can inflate their numbers. And finally, such a poll also gathers results from all skill levels, from new players to veterans, from hyper-casuals to hardcore Savage Raiders. Anyone could have voted. However, I do feel that the jobs did get ranked in a way that kinda makes sense with the things we know would make a job difficult. So to summarize, warriors tend to have their difficulty in the lower levels before Raw Intuition and Inner Release help them to make the job much easier to manage. After that, the difficulty comes from primarily aligning Infuriate users with raid buffs, which can become complicated due to the unpredictable nature of this cooldown. Paladins have their difficulty in the lower levels where they lack self-healing in particular, and as their rotation gets filled in, the defensive options also fill out. But that doesn't change the fact that their burst is rather specific, and cooldowns can awkwardly fall outside. Dark Knights have their difficult part before TBN is acquired, and once it is, using TBN is what often causes trouble. Although, once you advance to trying to optimize around your raid team, using all your cooldowns just right and collecting that extra Dark Arts for the bigger burst, for a lot of players, elevates Dark Knight way past Warrior and Paladin in difficulty. And finally, Gunbreaker's difficulty comes from its more involved rotation. Where Warrior and Dark Knight can stockpile resources if they so choose, Gunbreaker must stockpile resources for their burst to actually work. And this burst is so strict in this way that a single mistake can ruin it. And adding in raid coordination mostly just emphasizes the importance of timing this just right. Now, I admit that I probably may have forgotten details or may have even skipped quietly over something important in my analysis in this video. So, if you have anything to add about the difficulty or ease of any of the jobs, I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Endwalker, Warrior's Inner Release simply made all their attacks critical direct hits and removed all beast gauge costs. It gave you 10 seconds of this effect, which was, with enough skill speed, just enough to fit 5 fell cleaves in. You would also use Onslaught and Upheaval in this window, which also both had beast gauge costs at the time. However, as Inner Chaos and Chaotic Cyclone already had built-in direct crits, you would rather not use Infuriate during this window. Oh, also, Inner Release had a 90-second cooldown.